So, full disclosure, now that we're here in Unit 2, we are going to be limiting our conversations in practical ethics to essentially only those conditions under which we can pretty much exclusively talk about humans. We're going to essentially artificially limit our discussion to the human life cycle, beginning from life all the way to death. And that is sort of the way I've organized this unit. Now, to be honest, that is not the only way to kind of arrange these discussions. Obviously, there is a hint of anthropocentrism here, focusing only on humans. So I should mention that there are non-anthropocentric approaches, of course. So let me just kind of mention these, just so you know what's out there that I'm essentially not going to cover. Well, I guess maybe I'll sort of cover this view. Extensionism is a view, that very famously Peter Singer basically advocates. And Singer extends the moral community to all sentient beings. This is a very utilitarian ethic, and Singer is perhaps one of the most famous utilitarians. And so this is, it is a viable option, and we'll sort of cover it. But largely, even when Singer is discussing it, it almost is seen through a slightly anthropocentric lens. But technically, it is non-anthropocentric because technically part of the moral community includes non-humans, lots and lots of non-humans, essentially any living thing that can feel pain or pleasure. So that's Singer's approach, and that is called extensionism. It does go farther than that. So biocentrism, Goodpaster has some papers and a book, I think, on this. He extends the moral community to include even plants. So essentially any living thing whatsoever. To me, that's already kind of far-fetched, but that's not to say that plants, can be exterminated or anything like that. Obviously, that's not good for humans or plants. But it already seems like we're verging into territory that's difficult to conceptualize easily. Ecocentrism goes even farther. So Rod Nash argues that even rivers and land ought to have moral and legal rights. So this is going further and further, extending the moral community as far as is conceivable. After this, you would have to go into planetary rights, or maybe rights for a solar system, or I'm not sure. But it seems like, at least for an introductory ethics course, these are the only views that would even be possibly considerable. And we're actually not even going to go that far. So, by the way, I got all this from Schrader-Frichet's chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Practical Ethics. But let me just kind of defend why I'm keeping it to closer to the anthropocentric perspective. So let me just say some things here against non-anthropocentric approaches. And I'll be stealing the words here of Tom Regan, someone we're going to cover in the lesson on animal rights. So according to Regan, 1988, environmental fascism refers to the dangerous consequences that arise if one attempts to maximize biotic welfare. If one maximizes biotic welfare independent of human interests, then under some circumstances one could fail to recognize human rights and allow humans to die whenever human welfare seemed at odds with biotic welfare. So Tom Regan was worried about that approach, and he didn't think it was a good idea. And, it's not terribly far-fetched either. I think of Poison Ivy from the DC Comics universe, and this appears to be a radically environmental, non-anthropocentric perspective, and she moves pretty fast into killing humans, right? So these are things we, are rightfully concerned about, given that we are humans. So perhaps Tom Regan has a point. Tom Regan famously awards rights only to animals, and only to some animals at that, those animals that are the subject of a life. So more on that in a lesson called The Jungle. So Regan there going after potentially two of the other views that we're looking at, biocentrism and ecocentrism. So there, I can make kind of a minor point here that it almost seems far-fetched to even try to include, rivers and plants into the moral community, because how would you even know what their interests are? So animals that are subjects of a life, we know what their interests are. To be a subject of a life, you have to have an individual welfare that you care about. You care about your own life. So that makes sense to all of us. We care about our own life. But it's not clear at all that plants have any of that, much less a river. I mean, rivers are so far-fetched. This is not to say we shouldn't protect rivers, but to include them as members of the moral community seems, well, Regan would say something more, erudite and scholarly. I'll just call it outrageous. It just kind of seems a little too far. Singer also makes his case for extensionism and by default against bio and ecocentrism. So I'm stealing this from Singer's book, The Expanding Circle. Now, this is a new edition. I don't have the old edition, but apparently he's made the same case since, the 70s or 80s or whenever this first published. So towards the end of chapter 4 of The Expanding Circle, Singer makes the case that the boundary of sentience is the most practical one. This is because our moral reasoning cannot be impartial about non-sentient things like trees. So with other sentient creatures, that is, other creatures that can feel pleasure and pain, well, we have that to relate with them about. But just imagine trying to take into consideration during a moral analysis the interests of a tree. I'm not sure what it feels like to be a tree. I'm not sure there is anything that it feels like to be a tree, right? So Singer kind of lays out his point this way. This is because if we were to try to imagine what it would be like from the perspective of a tree, there would just be a blank. You wouldn't have any experiences. There probably isn't something there is like to be a tree. So it would just be nothing. This is not to say, then, that ecological considerations shouldn't be incorporated into our reasoning. Rather, we must allow our intuitions to be guided by inhabiting the perspective of all sentient beings, and that should indirectly take care of the environment. So Singer, again, he's not saying let's just not care about the environment. He actually is quite the activist for environmentalism. He began his own Green Party in Australia, his native Australia. So he's definitely an environmentalist. He just doesn't think that taking the perspective of a tree or a river is helpful during any kind of moral calculus. So obviously from the utilitarian perspective, which is the one that he holds, he's going to say something like, yeah, all you need to do is take care of sentient beings and the environment should take care of itself, essentially. So, once we create an excellent environment for sentient beings, the environment itself will also be healthy. Everyone will be healthy in that, under those, conditions. So, essentially what I'm doing here is I'm definitely playing God. I'm sort of being anthropocentric here in this course, in this unit, and I'm artificially limiting our conversation just to the human life cycle. We're going to begin, right before birth, I guess, and take it all the way to death. Now, admittedly, like I said, this is anthropocentric. I've been called much worse, so I'm okay with that label. I might add, though, that it's not like, there's the tyranny of the clock. Okay, so we have a limited amount of time. We have to cover this material. So obviously, part of the consideration here for limiting it to humans is just that, there's not enough time to cover every perspective. But a second thing is, it's already hard enough just limiting it to humans. So let me give you some food for thought here, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. we're going to talk about, well, I don't know what you would call this other than genocide, but it isn't what you might expect. So in this history of the mosquito, or I guess it's the human history of the mosquito, which, yes, by the way, I read a book on the history of the mosquito. I think it was excellent, by the way, so give it a whirl. So in chapter 19 of this book, Weingard begins with a description of modern mosquito-borne viral outbreaks, like West Nile virus and Zika, and then he moves on to the consideration of annihilation. So this is, I think, fascinating stuff. We're talking about here about gene editing technology like CRISPR, which maybe you've heard about. So perhaps using gene editing technology, we can engineer mosquitoes so as to not be vectors for disease, or alternatively, we can engineer mosquitoes out of existence. So it turns out that only the females bite. And so maybe you can just engineer every mosquito. Basically, you make some mosquitoes by manipulating their genes that will only reproduce males, right? So they, anything that they reproduce will only be male. And then you throw them out into the environment. Of course, they will only make males, so there will be more males. So there will be less mosquitoes biting people. That's already an improvement. And if this continues and only males are being made, guess what's going to happen after a couple generations? Well, male and male can't mate, so there goes mosquitoes. Weingard goes out of his way to really explain something here. It appears that mosquitoes only do two things: make more mosquitoes and kill humans. There is no obvious kind of environmental benefit to mosquitoes. Bees pollinate. Mosquitoes don't do anything. They just kill lots of humans. Lots. So, you can take a look at the numbers there, and it's kind of shocking that it's this high in the 21st century, not around us, but in other parts of the world. So let's just purely take the anthropocentric perspective here, and we'll see the consideration is already hard enough. Just thinking about humans is going to be hard enough, okay? So let's take a look at this. On the one hand, one might argue we are rapidly approaching a population size that is past the ecological carrying capacity of our planet. To obliterate the greatest killer of the human species could throw off the delicate balance of our global ecosystem. So this is a Malthusian concern, right? We're overpopulated. If we keep doing this, things are going to get really bad for humans. So maybe we kind of need this almost like a pressure release, right? The mosquitoes are killing lots of humans, and this objection says something like, well, good, because otherwise, to even consider population control, people already think that's controversial. No, we don't want to do that. So maybe this is kind of a natural population control. Maybe if we do let population growth to get out of hand, things would be worse. So it's better instead, paradoxically, to just let humans die of Zika and other mosquito-borne illnesses than to eradicate mosquitoes and just suffer the consequences of overpopulation. Well, one consideration right there. We must remember that we are part of a global system that we are already impacting in potentially catastrophic ways. Can we really be so sure that eliminating this population dampener is a good idea? That's the Malthusian concern, right? On the other hand, though, some of you can already kind of sense that sounds morally horrible. Well, we have to let people die from mosquito-borne illnesses, preventable mosquito-borne illnesses, because that's the best we can do. So here, let's look at the other side of the ledger here. On the other hand, if we care about justice and fairness, we must obliterate this massive killer as soon as is feasibly possible. This is because diseases like malaria disproportionately affect some continents, like Africa, and not others, like North America. So this is clearly the case. If we're trying to be impartial at all, it seems like, well, there is this killer and it's disproportionately affecting one group of people. And it just really seems callous to say, well, it's not us. and maybe we need them to die. There's something really twisted about that, right? It seems morally, well, problematic would be to come down with an actual verdict on this, but in the very least, morally questionable. I mean, that's a better way to put it. In fact, the economic cost of malaria and other diseases might be part of why Africa consists mostly of developing countries. So, I mean, if you look at things, I was recently looking at the numbers on flu. So it looks like flu just in the United States costs a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars in loss of productivity every year. That's an astoundingly large amount of money. And that's just a flu. Now imagine something like malaria being rampant or being very prevalent in some countries in Africa. That economic cost is not negligible, right? Malaria is worse than the flu. So it seems that, there is this natural, quote unquote natural, this mosquito-borne illness that seems to be really negatively affecting some places. It would be morally callous, I'll say that word again, to just simply say, well, that we do need a population dampener. Let's not do anything about this. It seems like the right thing to do is to lift this economic oppression off of this group of people. As such, considerations of the equality of all peoples behoove us to eradicate this disease and its carrier. So the point of this little, food for thought, and the one that follows, isn't to come up with a decisive verdict on what to do about mosquitoes. Although, if you want to know my opinion, kill them all. But that's not the point of this here, food for thought. The point here is actually to notice how difficult these decisions are just taking the anthropocentric perspective. All right, now imagine if you were to try to extend that to nature itself. I'm not sure. I mean, that would just make the calculus impossible, probably counterintuitive, as Peter Singer notes. So just limiting it to humans, it's still already difficult enough. And so it almost seems like we shouldn't overly complicate things either in life or in this college class, right? So it's tough just from the anthropocentric perspective. If anything, maybe this book and this scenario that I'm about to talk about is kind of highlights all the difficulties that arise, so moral decisions, even if they are artificially limited to considering only humans, can be difficult, heartbreaking, and controversial. Now, I can't recommend this book enough, only if you want to become extremely depressed. So Fink's 5 Days at Memorial tells a story of what happened at a hospital in New Orleans during and after Hurricane Katrina, once the levee broke and the power went out. So this is a tough read, but it would be even tougher, is what I'm trying to say right now, if you wanted to think of rivers and trees and the planet as a whole too. Just thinking about humans, well, that'll be enough for us.